Thank you for attending today's webinar. It's on one of my all-time favourite topics, chicken behaviour. And the first project I want to discuss is led by University of New England, but it's a collaborative project with the University of Vienna, University of Southern Queensland and SARDI, and of course funded by AgriFutures. And it's all about optimising range use through the rearing environment. So free-range chicken meat doesn't have an extremely long history. In fact, it was 1998 when we saw the first commercial-scale free-range chicken meat brand. And at that stage, it was only about 1% of the market. In 2006, we saw that Australia's consumption and love for chicken meat overtook red meat consumption and became Australia's preferred meat. Back to free range, the demand for free range has increased. So between 2010 and 20, the demand has increased so much that it's about 20% of the current market. However, there's quite a bit of controversy surrounding free range chicken production and what that means. And some consumers suggest that it's not only about giving the choice of accessing an outdoor range, but they want to know that that particular chicken parmigiana has been out on the range at some point in time. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because there has been some evidence to show that range use is positively associated with chicken welfare. And this research started in 2014 at the University of Sydney, where they showed an improved development of the gizzard associated with frequent range visits. We continued some of this research at the Animal Welfare Science Centre at the University of Melbourne, showing that range use was associated with better cardiovascular function, improved leg health, and a reduced stress response, both behaviourally and physiologically. However, range use is highly variable. So some chickens will never access the range and some use it really infrequently. In fact, it takes an average of 3 to 5 days for a chicken to first access the range after they've been given the first opportunity, which doesn't seem like a long time, but it's actually, for some of these birds, 33% of their overall lifetime ranging opportunities. And we know that the majority of the birds stay close to the shed, where some of these welfare relationships are associated not only with frequency of ranging, but the distance ranged from the shed. So if it's important to consumers and good for bird welfare, how do we get the birds out on the range? So this is a typical rearing environment of a meat chicken commercial shed. And you can see plenty of opportunities for feed and water, and they've got conspecifics. But you might also notice that it's relatively simple and not very dynamic. And we wondered if at 21 days of age, when those doors open out to the range, it's such a dynamic and complex range environment that maybe the contrast between the two environments is preventing birds from either accessing the range or delaying that range use. So we wondered, if we provided a bit more complexity in the rearing environment, could this prepare birds to range? So we asked, does a complex rearing environment prepare birds to range? And how we answered this question was we had 3 treatment groups. The first one was a control. So these are our facilities at UNE here, our free range facilities. The birds had wood shavings, water, feed. We had a little bit of extra help on heat with these big old brooders. And at 21 days of age, this door at the back would open, that's the pop hole, and they would have access to the outdoor range. Our visual access treatment gave birds visual access to the range from day old. And we did that by simply putting a perspex barrier over the pop hole and opening that pop hole. So they were protected from the elements, but they could see out. And our third treatment was what we called a complexity treatment. And it seems like a bit of an odd treatment, but let me take you through it. It's more complex than the normal rearing environment. And what we included was one of these visual barriers or vertical panels. And these have been used quite a bit in the meat chicken literature. And it's shown to have impacts on spatial distribution of the birds. But we also thought that it may help to increase that, develop that part of the brain associated with object permanence. So object permanence is when you know something exists, even though you can't see it. And we thought that may be important for range use. The second resource we provided in this treatment was an artificial hay bale. So we know that there's some hesitancy to use hay bales due to biosecurity concerns. So we made an artificial one with those important characteristics. So a structure that the chickens could sit by, as we know they like to do when they're young, next to a hay bale. They could pull it apart by pulling out some of these coloured strips of paper. And then when they were old enough, they could sit on top. And the third resource we provided was some streamers on a fan. And it seems a little silly, but we thought every shed has fans in there that turn on and off periodically. We thought by putting streamers on there, it might give the birds a little bit of a fright when they're young. And the research shows that a little bit of a fright, not too much, but just a little bit, can actually improve stress resilience of animals. So we thought this might be critical and an easy way to achieve for our meat chickens. So they were our three treatments. We reared the birds from 0 to 20 days in these environments, and then we opened up the pop holes and gave them range access from 21 to 41 days. Before we gave them range access, we measured anxiety, cognition, and we also gave them a little RFID band. So this is like a chip at your supermarket. So when they walked over those pop holes over an antenna, it would register and say which bird went out at what time and how long they went out for. So we could tell individual ranging behaviour. At 14 days of age, we fit accelerometers on some of our chickens to assess activity. And weekly, we weighed and measured foot and leg health. At the end of life, we assessed cognition again and also some post-mortem scores. So what we found is that fewer complexity birds actually access the range. So what you're looking at here is the darker part of these pie charts is the proportion of each treatment that access the range. So 89% for control, 95% for visual access, but 21% of the complexity birds never access the range. We saw that birds with visual access the range faster. So we can see here, this is latency to access the outdoor range. Within 1 or 2 days, most of our visual access birds had actually gone out onto the range compared to our control and our complexity birds. And in fact, this is the range, that 3 to 5 days that I mentioned in the introduction, and we were able to come to get our access birds, our visual access birds out on the range prior to that. And what we also saw was that visual access birds access the range more days and so more frequently. So what we've got here is the number of days that the range was accessed on average, and we've got females in the light green and males in the dark green, because we know that there are sex differences with behaviour and ranging behaviour is no different. But what's interesting to me here is that you can see there's a sex difference in our control group and complexity, but not so much in our visual access group. And regardless of sex, visual access birds access the range more frequently. So we show that visual access to an outdoor range during rearing increases ranging behaviour. But why and how? So really understanding the mechanism of how that works is really critical, because if putting windows in your shed isn't for you, then you can target those mechanisms using other treatments to get the same outcome. So it was critical for us to understand the mechanism. The first question we asked was perhaps the visual access birds were less anxious. And we measured anxiety through an attention bias test. The attention bias test includes training the birds to be isolated in an arena with a bowl full of mealworms. So we put them in there 4 times and let them consume the mealworms. On that 4th time, 10 seconds after they start eating, we play an alarm call. So the alarm call is signalling to the birds there's danger, and the birds will stop eating, become vigilant. And the theory is the more anxious they are, the longer they'll stay vigilant and the longer it'll take them to go back and feed. Of course, one of the problems with this test is those extremely anxious birds won't eat at all at any of those periods of time. So that's the first thing we checked. Oops. Hear it again. So what I've got here is the dark proportion of these pie charts is those birds that passed or those birds that consumed the mealworms. And we can see there's actually no difference between our control, visual access and complexity birds. But what we did see was that the complexity birds took longer to go back and consume the mealworms after the alarm call was played, suggesting that they may be more anxious. So what this is a survival curve, and basically this is the proportion of each treatment. And every time it steps down, that's a proportion of the treatment that consumed or went back to feeding after the alarm call. And it's related to the x-axis, which is telling us how long it took them. So if we look at the control group, the blue line, we know that all of those birds ate within 1 second of hearing the alarm call. So popped the head up, had a look around, no danger, straight back to eat. Took about 30 to 40 seconds for all of our visual access birds, but up to 300 seconds for our complexity birds, suggesting that the complexity birds were more anxious. Now, I'd be hesitant to take these results as gospel in terms of complexity group, because it's a real small proportion of that group. But what this does tell us is that the mechanism of getting those birds out on the range from the visual access group wasn't reduced anxiety. So we asked, well, perhaps those visual access birds had better leg health. And this is our fantastic honours student, Natalie Mendez, who worked tirelessly on the project to assess leg health. And she took leg health measures weekly, behavioural measures, using a latency to lie test. So she would put the birds in a small arena with a small amount of tepid water in the bottom. Now, chickens hate sitting in water, but they will if they have sore legs. So we measure the time it takes them to sit as an indicator of leg health. There was no difference between any of our treatments in the time taken to sit before they had range access. Natalie also did another measure, which was to assess bone breaking strength post-mortem. And so she used some of the gear we've got here at University of New England, which applies pressure to the tibia. And we can measure how much pressure it takes to break that bone in newtons. And what we saw is that there was no difference in bone breaking strength between our control, visual access and complexity group. So didn't look like the mechanism was the fact that visual birds had better leg health. We also saw no impact on cardiovascular function, no impact on body weight or carcass weight. But what we did see was that visual access improved cognitive flexibility. And how we tested this was we developed and made a chicken-sized maze, And like all good researchers, I tested it on my daughter first to make sure it was safe for chickens. And the idea of this maze is that you have one side associated with a colour and the other side associated with another. So we've chosen blue and yellow here. And we teach the chickens a basic colour discrimination task. So there would be rewards either on either side, either colour. But let's say, for example, it was on the yellow side, and we would teach the birds that the treat or the reward was on that side with that colour. After they'd learned that task, we would then reverse it and flip it. And they would have to learn that the reward was no longer on the right-hand side with the yellow, it was the left-hand side with the blue. And as Albert Einstein said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And I'm not going to say that some of these chickens were stupid, but there was certainly some chickens who would keep going down that original arm. Those chickens that had more cognitive flexibility would learn that the reward wasn't in there, look for it elsewhere, and then learn that the other side was the correct arm. So this is our test in action. You can see this girl, she knows that the reward is in the yellow. You can see she can't see it until she gets around that panel. What's interesting about this is that there was no difference between our treatment groups in the ability or the time it took to actually learn that colour discrimination task. But when we flipped it, our visual access birds actually learned that task quicker. So again, here's one of our survival curves. We've got the proportion here. Every time it pops down, that means one of the birds successfully learned the task. And instead of time along here, we've got number of failed attempts it took to learn the task. And we see that visual access birds, more of them learned it and much quicker. So of course, that's only part of the story. So we still have brains to assess. We've got more leg health assessments. We've got those accelerometers that's going to tell us about activity. We also have corticosterone in faeces and some meat quality samples. So we're still working through this data to see the whole story. And the rearing environment is only one component of this life cycle. And so we're also currently looking at the range environment out on commercial farms at the moment. And in particular, the orientation that is best to get birds out on the range and to get them out further. So vertical, horizontal, or in a straight line. And ultimately, we'll take the best rearing environment and the best range environment onto farm to see which is best, where you could place your bets, or perhaps if it's cumulative. So we showed that providing visual access to an outdoor range during rearing alters ranging behaviour. It reduces the time first taken to access the range. It increases the number of birds on the range and increases the time spent on the range. We also showed that rearing environments that improve cognitive flexibility may be the key to preparing birds to range and optimising range use. So I'd like to just acknowledge my collaborators in this project, Dr. Carolyn de Koning, Professor Jean-Louis Rolt, Dr. Natalie McCarthy, and of course, Natalie Mendez, our honours student on the project who's funded by Poultry Hub Australia, and a whole host of technicians and academics and students who have helped collect this massive amount of data, and of course, AgriFutures for funding.